Welcome back to Shared Humanity. My name is Nelba Márquez-Greene, and I serve as the activist in residence at the Yale School of Public Health under the umbrella of the Firearm Injury Prevention Initiative. I talk to the humans behind the headlines of gun violence in a moment in history where all too often we focus on everything but our shared humanity. Today's guest is Kay Warren. Kay Warren is an author, speaker, and co-founder of Saddleback Church with her husband, Rick, in Lake Forest, California. They served there until September of 2022. After the death of her son, Matthew, who lived with serious mental illness for most of his life, she founded Saddleback's Hope for Mental Health initiative and the Hope for Mental Health community to provide a safe and welcoming place for individuals and families to receive accurate psychoeducation, build community, and be fully incorporated into the life of the church. Kay was a board member for the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention for 8 years and is active in mental health suicide prevention efforts in Orange County, California. She is also my friend, and I'm thankful she's here today. I would love for you to tell me about your family.
Well, as you said, my husband and I started Saddleback Church in 1980. We were there almost 43 years. I've spent most of my adult life in one place doing one thing with one group of people, and it was just the greatest privilege of my life. I loved it. We've been married almost 50 years. Next year will be our 50th anniversary, and it's like, wow, I can't quite believe that, but we've made it. We made it, and we built a strong and stable relationship. But it has been blood, sweat, and tears. I'll tell you that. I have 3 kids, 2 living children, and one, Matthew, who is in heaven. He passed away in 2013. He died by suicide. Sometimes I say he died from mental illness because he definitely had serious mental illness from the time he was 7. He was diagnosed when he was 7. He probably could have been diagnosed sooner if I had understood that children can experience mental illness. I didn't know that they could. I knew he was different than his siblings, but it just never occurred to me that the differences were because of mental illness. So he could have been diagnosed at probably 3 or 4. But at 7, he was diagnosed with clinical depression, and just his life over the next 20 years was a series of very tortured hills and valleys. Um, he just had just about, I mean, if I listed all the different diagnoses that he had, it'd be almost ridiculous. But I think all that means is that mental illness can be very complicated and complex and not simple to diagnose always or know how to treat. And so when he passed away at 27, our lives were just completely devastated. He has an older brother and sister. So I have 2 older children who have my 5 incredible grandchildren who are the absolute joy and delight of my life. And, we've walked through some very, very painful times because my husband was the pastor of a pretty well-known church. When Matthew died, it was national news. I'll never forget seeing the scrolling banner, pardon me, scrolling banner on CNN, announcing the death of our son by name. And it meant we had to live our grief out in a very public way. Everyone, had an opinion about what we should have done differently. And if we had done this, he would still be alive. And, people just felt free to critique him and us. And that was hard to do in the public eye. And that's one of the places you and I have connected is both of us had tragic losses in very public ways. And so, yeah, that's kind of the basic. When Matthew was doing well, he was the kindest, sweetest, most gentle. I have the most fabulous cards through the years of where he wrote such loving messages. I have Mother's Day cards, and he thought it was really funny to buy cards that weren't really related to whatever the occasion was. So I might get a birthday card for Mother's Day, or I might get a Valentine's card on Mother's Day. I mean, he thought that was really funny. And then he would write just the sweetest messages. And so healthy Matthew was just unbelievably kind and warm and creative and funny and generous. Unhealthy Matthew, when his mental illness became incredibly pervasive, he could be a very scary person. And when he died, he was not in a good place in any way. And it was very frightening and very traumatic, even the months leading up to his death. And then of course his death just catapulted us into catastrophic loss.
There's so much I want to respond to and what you shared with us. And the first thing I'll ask is you mentioned the unique dynamic of suffering a private, tragic loss, and yet the world feeling like it has rights to opine without your consent, without your knowledge, without much fact, but mostly without consent. What it's like to look at a phone or a computer and see your family situation scrolling on the bottom of a news screen. That's a very unique type of thing for survivors.
Yeah, it is. And I feel like your particular story has continued to be news story. You know, ours, fortunately, in terms of that public news awareness factor, has receded. But you know, everybody wanted to interview us. You know, soon after Matthew died, and we did end up going on Piers Morgan at the time, 13 years, excuse me, 11 years ago, 2013, 11 years ago. And you know, People magazine was interested, and all sorts of people. And in some ways, it was unavoidable. I couldn't, there was nothing we could do to stop it. The interest was going to keep coming no matter what. Even if we just went in our house and closed our doors, we couldn't live that way for the rest of our lives. We had to keep living. And so it meant, in some ways, having to engage the public. But we learned what our boundaries were, what we would talk about, what we wouldn't talk about, who we would talk to, who we wouldn't, in what context we would share. And then I felt it was very empowering to me when I felt like I was able to take over my story myself. And I began to make those choices of, I intentionally would bring it up, or I would talk about it in another interview or at a speaking engagement. I really focused on, I just jumped into focusing on suicide prevention and helping families. And that was, in one way, me sort of taking back my story from the public. It was to control it as best I could, and sometimes successfully, sometimes not as successful, sometimes not as successfully.
Something about you that's also very unique, that I find very unique, is that you are very transparent with the ups and downs, right? When we first met, actually, was at an event, and I shared that my moments in that time had more downs than up, and that was sometimes a very difficult thing to admit in a faith community. And somehow you paddled in that water very courageously and said, I'm not going to lie about how difficult that is. I'm actually going to free other people by talking about the ups and the downs. Can you tell us, is that just your personality, or did you make that decision as well?
It was both. I think I made that decision early on in ministry, because when Rick and I got married, I have to go back to this because it was a linchpin moment for me. When we got married, we really didn't know each other very well, and we had a lot of marriage problems, like honeymoon city on. It was just rough. I mean, we came back from our honeymoon, both of us just going, "What have I done? Who are you? What have I just signed up for?" And, you know, of course, we get all the people going, "So how was your honeymoon?" And we're like, "Oh, it was great," you know, and inside we were just dying. But we were in ministry, we were clergy. And at that time, almost 50 years ago, it really wasn't okay to talk about, you know, problems in your marriage or that things weren't going well. And we both, Rick ended up in the hospital with depression. I ended up thinking I was losing my mind. I was commuting to college 60 miles away, and I would drive back and forth from school sobbing, just thinking I was losing my mind. All that to say, it kind of forced us into therapy pretty quickly to try to figure out because we were determined we were going to make it work, but we thought it might kill us in the process, and it just about did. But we came out of that knowing that we wanted to go into ministry and that we were not going to fake it, that we were going to be as real and as honest as we could be with our congregation, that we weren't going to pretend that we had a perfect marriage, that we had a perfect life. So I would say I made that decision consciously many years ago, that we were going to live our lives as openly as felt appropriate, but also just to give other people the hope that you don't have to have it all together to be a good person or to have faith. So when Matthew died, it was sort of a natural extension of those decisions we had already made about how we were going to live our lives. And we just we knew immediately that not only was it national news, but we also made the intentional decision to share that he died by suicide. We weren't going to hide that. I can't tell you the number of people through the years who have come up since he died and whispered in my ear, I lost my father to suicide, or I lost my mother, or I lost my child. And many of them will follow that whisper with, and we don't talk about it.
Mm.
Oh, it's not a topic within our family, let alone anywhere else. And I just, it was so horrific to lose Matthew, to think that I had to hold it inside and not share it, and to share how he died, to share that he died by suicide. I just thought, I can't bear that.
Yeah.
I will lose my mind. So, as much for my own mental health, as well as modeling for other people, the fact that suicide is something we can talk about and should talk about, it was to take care of myself as much as anything.
And despite the fact that we have this loss in common, I see this among many moms who've lost children to suicide by firearm. That whisper still exists. There's so much stigma. There is so much judgment. There is so much lack of grace for people who've lost children to suicide, and never mind by firearm, when actually statistics bear out that suicide by firearm is the largest cause of gun death, more than mass shootings, more than domestic violence, more than community crime, more than anything
Yeah.
else. It's actually it's not a silent epidemic because families are being impacted, but it's our unwillingness to talk about suicide that plays into this silence, and I would say shame. And it's very, very difficult for me to hear from a mom who says, I also lost my child, by suicide. They died so it's not the same as yours. It's almost like they apologize. And just have to stop every time and say, stop. I don't want you to apologize to me. I'm so sorry for this loss that you're carrying. And it's
Well, that's gracious of you, though. I've always felt that was gracious of you, Nelba, because I think while suicide and murder are probably the two, every loss, every death in every circumstance is incredibly painful to people. Every loss, every death is. Murder and suicide add some layers, I think, to loss. I mean, I've watched both my mother and my father. I took care of them as they were in their dying days from, cancer and then Alzheimer's, and their deaths were very peaceful and gentle, and we were there and we got to hold them and love them, and I grieved. It was not at all like losing my son
yeah,
to suicide,
yeah.
the fact that he took his life in such a violent way. And so there were layers. And so I think, to me at least, I've always interpreted that, and you and I've talked about this, is I think that it feels like, at least with murder, that was something done to another person. With suicide, the person themselves kills themselves. And so I think people get just so uncomfortable with all of it. They don't know what to do with murder. They don't know what to do with they don't know what to do with violent death. And then they try to parse it out. Well, okay, is this one worse than that? Is that one worse than that? Is that? And all I can just say is it's all complicated. It's all horrible. It all hurts like crazy. And I just think you're gracious in the way that you've responded.
I think by and large, being involved in the tragedy that we were involved with automatically lends itself to a lot of support. Unfortunately, with deaths via firearm, there's almost a hierarchy. We'll give empathy to that, we'll give empathy to
Right.
this. And one of the reasons I wanted to do a series like this that elevated the voices of survivors is so that people could hear and see that ultimately what fundamentally ties us is this grief we have to deal with for the rest of our lives and how these losses impact our families until the day we see our loved ones again. So I wanted to talk about what you've done. But before we get there, I would love to talk about some of the myths that come along with, having a child who has mental illness. And one of them is that families don't know, or families don't try, or this just must happen to some families. And I know in your family and so many others, families are trying. Families are looking for help. Families are doing everything they can. It's not always that families didn't know. So, can you talk to us more about some of the myths that you have to kind of walk through?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there are myths around mental illness and there are myths around suicide and suicide prevention, and they overlap a little bit. But I think, yeah, first of all, around mental illness, people think it's rare and, it's not very common when, there's about 45 million people in the United States right now living with a mental illness or will be diagnosed in the coming years. So that's about 1 in 5. That's
It's a high
very,
number. Yep.
very common. It's very common. The fact is, every one of us knows or loves somebody who has a mental health struggle. So it's very, very common. But the great thing, if you will, is only about 20% of those people have what's classified as serious mental illness. So that means 80% of the people who have a diagnosable mental illness live pretty normal lives. They're able to manage it, medication, stress management, healthy eating, their
Therapy.
therapists,
Yep.
yeah, therapy, medication, relational help, emotional help, their faith. There's most people are able to live good lives living with, some sort of a mental health diagnosis. But for about 20% of the people, it is a much more difficult diagnosis and their lives are much more impacted and they require a lot more support, a lot more medication supervision, a lot more therapeutic um, consultation and help. So those families, I've chosen really to concentrate mostly on families who have kids with serious mental illness as our son did. And so I love being able to support those moms, which I know you want to talk about in a minute, so I'll get back to that. But I think with mental health, first is that they just think it's not common, that it's rare, and it's actually very common. And I think that there's some myths that people with mental illness are violent. And when actually studies show that people with serious mental illness are actually 10 times more likely to be victims of violence than the average population. Um, and so the myths around mental illness is, yeah, that you're crazy, that it's your fault. If you're in a faith community, sometimes it can be, well, you have sin in your life, and therefore, if you would just confess your sins, that God will automatically heal you. And that just adds such layers of guilt and shame to people living with mental illness. It causes families to keep things quiet. Different cultural beliefs around mental illness affect how people deal with it or whether they get help. uh, Sometimes people just hope, like if it's in a child, most mental illnesses, at least half of it shows up by age 14 and 3/4 by age 24. And so sometimes parents will just be in such denial. Sometimes it's the parents who are in denial or ignorance and think that they'll either outgrow it or they're just being a wild kid or they're a disobedient kid. I love the title of Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey's book, What Happened to You? Because what is so long been the response of parents and teachers and coaches and adults is, what's the matter with
Yeah.
you when it's
What's
a
wrong
kid?
with
When
you?
really the question should be,
What happened to you?
what's happened to you? And with that growing understanding, I think it allows more kids like Matthew to be diagnosed sooner and get help sooner, and therefore will have, much more chance of a better outcome. So those are, I think, some of the myths that, yeah. But then around suicide, I think the myths are that that if you ever have suicidal ideation, then it's inevitable that you will take your life, or you will always have suicidal ideation, or they think that all suicides happen, without warning, that just boom, somebody just takes their life one day and there were no signs and no warnings. And actually, there are almost always warning signs if people know what they are.
Mm.
So it behooves every person, let alone every parent, to know what the signs of suicide are, so that when their kid or someone they love or a friend starts behaving in a different way than they're used to, or something changes, they're alert to that and can pursue that in conversation, and figure out if something is going on. I think that one of the myths about suicide is that people who die who take their lives are selfish, when actually most often these are not people who want to die and create then that they're babies, that they're weak and they just need to suck it up. Hey, you should hear my, people, well, you think you got it bad, you should hear my story. I'm making it, you should make it. Instead of understanding that suicide is very complex. It's rarely just one cause. There can be mental illness. There are also poverty, a health diagnosis, loss of a job, trouble acculturating in a new community. I mean, just yesterday, I heard of a man here recently from another country who lost his job. He's been here 6 months, lost his job, and came from another country in which it was very shameful to even have any mental health problems. And he didn't have mental health problems as much as the loss of his job and unable to provide for his family, and having difficulty adjusting to the culture here in the United States. That those are more likely the things that caused him to decide that it was hopeless,
Mm.
conclude that there was no help, that it was hopeless, that he was a failure, he couldn't support his family, he couldn't adjust to life here. And so rather than being selfish, it's actually people in great pain
Yeah.
who want really nothing more than just the pain to stop, and have concluded there's no other way for the pain to stop. So those are some of the myths, I think, around mental health and suicide.
Kate, there's one more I'd love to talk about, and that's for a long time we were trained and we were taught not to talk about it. Because if you
Yes,
talked about it, you're going to put the idea in someone's head. And that
that's
has
so common.
shifted. Can you talk to us about this shift?
Yeah, maybe you've seen some shifts that I mean, yes, we are definitely talking about it more as a society. A lot of schools have suicide prevention programs. It's in the in the health segment in school, in like high school and junior high. I still though talk to parents. So at the parental level, I feel like parents are still really anxious about bringing up the topic of suicide. So, maybe government, is bringing it up, schools are bringing it up, their public awareness campaigns. But I think at the family level, it feels to me like it's still pretty scary to look at your child, your husband, your wife, your mother, your father, and say, have you thought of killing yourself?
And ask the question
Oh,
for sure.
and
That's a big
ask
one.
those questions.
That's a big one.
Yeah.
I am
Yeah.
encouraged that it seems like in some school models, they are encouraging ask the question, right? Are you thinking about hurting yourself? Are you so sad that you're thinking about hurting yourself? Because if you are, there are other, and then to tell a trusted adult, right? Don't try to do the intervention yourself. Your job is just to ask the question and then find a trusted adult that you can
Right.
connect that other young person to. I am encouraged, and it's a start because we were taught once
It's
never to bring it up.
progress.
It's progress
Yes,
that we're starting
it's progress.
to ask.
Yeah.
And you were going to tell me, I think, about breathe.
I took a step back, thought about it, prayed about it, and got this idea that I want to focus on the families who were living the life we lived. and didn't have the support that we needed, who did not have the spiritual support, who didn't have a community of people where they could just be real and honest and say, other people are, I'd go to a women's group and the women would, be going, wow, this week my child won this award. Well, this week my child won this award. And oh, please pray because we're having trouble with homework. And I'm like,
Yeah.
yeah, well, my story was at those groups. Yeah, this was the week that we got another hole in the wall from, my son punched a hole in the wall in his anger and frustration, and I can't even get him, you get my
Yeah.
point.
Yeah.
I wanted to help those
Yep.
moms who were in that place of shame, helplessness, twisting themselves into pretzels, trying to find ways to help their kid. And so I started an organization called Breathe. I've since started a nonprofit called Hope for Brighter Tomorrows, and the Breathe outreach fits underneath it. And it's all about reaching those moms, having respite retreats for them at a retreat center nearby. I do monthly free Zoom calls with mental health professionals, well-known mental health professionals, and people with lived experience, and faith leaders, all where they in a safe, welcoming, warm environment where anybody can. And these, we just did one a few weeks ago. I'm still on that high because those women would get out of their car. We met them at their car, arms open wide. They collapse in our arms in tears. And it's like, I've never been in a place where everybody I looked at is going through the same thing I am. I don't feel alone. Well, you talk about life and joy. I mean, I just feel like, obviously, I get very animated
Your whole
because
face
it is
has changed
exactly,
talking
yes,
about this.
because I get to focus on life.
Yeah. Breathe is a program under Hope for Brighter Horizons. And if
Hope for brighter
Hope for
tomorrows.
Brighter Tomorrows. And
Yeah.
if someone listening is like, I want to check that out, or I want to learn more, or I want to support, or I want to connect, how would they do that?
Currently, they can go to my website, kwarren.com, and it's a curated site. I did not create all the content. Some of it I did, some of it I didn't. I just remembered all the times that I would want information about a diagnosis or mental illness or a treatment or medication or whatever. And you go to the internet and it's like 3 billion responses
Yeah.
to your one question.
Yeah.
And how do you know what to trust, whatever? So I was trying to create a site to kind of short circuit all of that. You could go there and get links from there. There's videos, tapes, audios, interviews, free downloadables, all kinds of things around that. It's transitioning to Hope for Brighter Tomorrows in a very short time. We're a brand new organization, the nonprofit is, so we're still building out our website. But for now, kwarren.com will get you there. You learn about the Breathe program, the next retreats, the next calls, how to join the Facebook page, all those things.
My next question, and I think I'll close with this unless there's something else you want to share, is how you retain hope in the midst of this arduous walk that includes child loss and grief.
The last few years of Matthew's life were so bad. I just felt like we were living in hell every single day. Is this the day he's going to take his life? Because he was talking about suicide constantly and making attempts and hospitalizations. And it was just torture for him, torture for us. And I felt my faith very wobbly. I wasn't sure I could survive if he died. And so I began to take verses from the Bible, or inspiring words, or lyrics to songs, and I put them in a box that is my hope box. It says hope on the front of it. And I would go through in the middle of the night when I was up with anxiety and didn't know where he was, or didn't know what had happened, or whether the next day would be the just all of that. I would go through that hope box in the middle of the night and sing those songs to myself, or read those verses, or look at the pieces of encouragement that people had sent me. And I had that. And then after he died, I actually felt like that hope box sort of mocked me, like hope had disappointed me. God had disappointed me. And I took everything out of there and thought I threw them away, but I actually guess I stuck them in a drawer somewhere. I found them a few months later. And so this hope box just sat there empty. And but it was an accurate reflection of me. I was empty of hope. And I had all these questions, like the one you mentioned, like, why did this happen to us? Why didn't God? Mine was, why didn't you stop him? Why didn't you stop him? Why wasn't our love enough? Why couldn't we make this different? When did he actually die? Because my intuition was different than what the coroner said, and that troubled me. And I just had all these questions. And sometimes people of faith, we're just like told not to question. We're not supposed to have questions. And the thing is, I had so many. I had so many mysteries. And a friend gave me this little mystery pot. It's a little, like it's this heavy duty cookware that you could, Le Creuset, it stands
Yep.
for the
Yep.
crucible. And she said, your faith is in the fire. It's in the crucible. And your questions and this all matters. You don't have to ignore it. And so I began to write out these questions that I have no answers for, that actually are mysteries. There's nobody on earth that can answer my questions. Nobody. And so I write them on a piece of paper and I've put them in the mystery pot because they're valuable. That my grief matters, my questions matter, those mysteries that have kept me up, they matter. And so I put them in this mystery pot. And so now I have my my hope box, because I had to repopulate it. I had to have hope. You can't live without it. I began to repopulate my hope box with things that I felt absolutely sure of, that weren't based on an earthly outcome. Like, I really believe in the story of Easter. I believe that Jesus conquered death and the grave. I believe he's alive. And if he's alive, Matthew is alive, because Matthew believed in God. And one day when I die, I will be alive. And so I have a verse in my hope box. The very first one I put back in there was, these bodies are buried in brokenness,
Mhm.
but they will be raised in strength. They are raised in weakness, but they will be raised in glory. And I said, that I can believe. I can believe that. That went back in my hope box. But right next to it is this little mystery pot full of questions that, if I let them, would drive me mad. But I really think that's what a true faith is. It can live with both hope and mystery. If you just have mystery without hope, you're going to be a bitter and barren person. If you have hope, but there's never been anything that challenged your faith and left you with mystery, you'll have this light, airy, ephemeral optimism that will not survive what you and I have been through. But together, hope and mystery, I can wait. I can wait.
Thank you for listening. Shared Humanity is produced by the Yale School of Public Health. Follow us on social media at Yale SPH and learn more at sph.yale.edu/shared humanity. Thank you to the Yale Porvu Center and Yale Broadcast Studio for their support. We hope this episode empowered you to take action toward positive change and hope.